younger years, how much time did you spend at the mall?
Despite me wanting to go to the mall, like today, um, not very much. Mostly just because the closest one to me was like 60 miles, like an hour drive for me and my folks. So it didn't happen very much. So I had to make my own fun and not enjoy the commerce that a mall provides. How about you, Mark? Where did you spend your time? Did you linger around a food court, hanging out at the somewhere between an Auntie Anne's, a Sbarro, and a Hot Topic?
Surprisingly, I did actually mention this in one of the retrospectives about Donkey Kong Country. The mom would disappear into Sears and J.C. Penney, kind of like Rick
Mm-hmm.
James in The Fog. She just kind of poof gone. So yeah, yeah, exactly. Game blouses, literally. But like, yeah, we would sometimes be left alone as children playing on the Super Nintendo display. The
Mm-hmm.
actual mall itself, though, like the larger food court area, all that stuff, not really. We
Mm-hmm.
were pretty much it was like special ops. We went to a store, we knew we were hitting, and then there was just the evac as soon as we were done there. So no, not a social gathering place,
No. Mm-mm.
which is kind of the opposite of Kevin Smith's Mallrats, which Joe we've chosen to talk about today. Uh, so
Yeah, it was either
yeah.
that or this intro is leading to us solely focusing on the Robin Sparkles Let's Go to the Mall episode of
Oh,
How I Met Your Mother, which making a whole episode of that would be a feat. While a great episode of How I Met Your Mother, I don't know if we could talk about it for a half hour to an hour. That'd be a bit
no,
much.
it'd be
Mm-mm.
quite a bit of filler, kind of like people
Oh,
stretching
yeah.
out the acolyte to talk about it for weeks on end. We're not doing that.
Is that too soon for the people who liked that show?
Is it?
Which I don't know. It might be. I mean, I'm not hating. I never watched it, and that's it's not nothing. Not a comment specifically about the Acolyte, as I've just kind of fallen off of Star Wars in general recently. Which, to the dismay of probably at least one or two characters in the movie we will be talking about, who thoroughly enjoy Star Wars and much of the other nerddom of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and before we kind of get there, though, there's a couple things, just data points we'll throw at you here. If you're not a
Mm-hmm.
Kevin Smith junkie, as believe it or not a lot of people are, and he kind of has that like cult following behind him within both the
Mm-hmm.
cinematic and the nerd world. But this film is actually the second one within the Viewist universe, which is his connected film series here that kicked off with Clerks in 1994, and then
Mm-hmm.
saw this film sneak in within 1995. But when I say sneak in, I mean it literally snuck in so well that nobody watched it when it came out. it was,
Yeah.
it was a bad situation.
Mm-hmm.
So
No, and Kevin Smith knows it. I think he's gone on the record for saying that people go up to cons and they say how much they loved this movie, and he's like, "That's great. How come you didn't go see it in the theater?" Like,
yeah,
because it just struggled. I mean, it is definitely a bomb in box office terms by any standard, and that it only made a third of what it cost to create. So against a $6 million budget, this only brought in $2 million, with I
man.
believe a nationwide release. So it wasn't like this was just kept into a corner somewhere or a limited release scenario. Mallrats was kind of everywhere, and
Yeah.
just at the same time apparently nowhere.
It's kind of a calculated risk because so much of the marketing for this movie, of which I have to assume was very little, involved this kind of like comic oriented thing. Like there's a lot of comic styling for the artwork of it, of course,
Mm-hmm.
the box art, of course, the poster work, all of it. And it has that little image of Stan Lee down on the bottom. So clearly, I think at this moment in time, we're just kind of seeing X-Men kind of see its own revival within the comic book realm, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not to the point where people are celebrating it like now, where comic books are, thriving. They're doing quite well.
Very, very. And if you're wondering about a time frame for this, I don't know if we said it, 1995 is when this movie hit theaters.
Yeah.
So like you said, like this is well before like comic book movies really take off, because what, Blade, that came out in what, 99, 2000?
It would only be a few years later, and
Yeah.
similar
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote failure where even though the first one was successful, but like
Mm-hmm.
not reaching like $1 billion audiences, like some of the
No.
MCU is able to.
No,
Yeah.
and despite its lack of success, Kevin Smith did try and get sequels for this made that never got picked up, including a TV series, which no one picked up. I don't know how recent his attempts are, but I think trying to make any movie centered around the youth or the basically the teenage early 20s demographics hanging out in the mall would have to be purely parody at this point
Uh,
at the state of malls in the United States, or at least like the ones that I have been to more recently, outside of a few staples like the Mall of America. That's a thing in and of itself, and that I think it's gonna be hard for that to go down because it's like a Midwest staple. But I don't know, Mark. When's the last time you went to a mall? What did it look like in there?
well, there are some pseudo successful malls near me here in the Madison
Mm-hmm.
area, which, although that's why I say pseudo successful, because
Mm-hmm.
we're still talking like a third of it has no occupancy, right? So
Yeah.
it's people still go there, though. There are
Mm-hmm.
events that happen in there, but not nearly to the extent that you could have like a movie filmed there without any extras being paid and go,
Mm-mm.
yeah, this is a
Yeah.
bustling place. This is,
Mm-hmm.
but in comparison, though, man, growing
Mm-hmm.
up, slightly different because
Yeah.
we lived in an area of California that only had Tanger outlet malls, which are a totally different type of
Mm-hmm.
thing, not all housed within one building. But at the same time, too, it would have to be parody because Joe, believe it or not, there was an era before the big box store. Like
Mm-hmm.
we didn't actually have those until the recent era here. We're talking like 30 years or so.
Yeah.
That's when that really shot off, and then you've got online shopping on top of that too. So
Mm-hmm.
this any sequel that they made with that would have to be like Prime Deals Rats or
Yeah.
DoorDash Rats, something different.
They could try to make like a Japanese like equivalent because when I was there, malls were still big, still a hit, still bustling. But yeah, here it's going to be kids hanging out on their computer waiting for Prime Day, and I don't think it's going to have quite the same effect. But speaking of the kids waiting around enjoying their time, I think it's time to start looking into who is in this movie. So when you talk about the Askewniverse, this does have some basically repeating actors and repeating characters within them as well. Because one person who does make his appearance in pretty much every Kevin Smith movie, outside of maybe a couple, is Ben Affleck. And
Hmm.
I don't think he's ever the same character from movie to movie. He's always someone different. Whereas you do have Kevin Smith himself with his friend Jason Mewes as Jay and Silent Bob, not respectively. I flipped them because of the namesake. They are always those two characters in these movies, as they are kind of the thing that always links the Askew universe together.
Yeah, it totally is. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to an extent, you do have Jason Lee, who plays Brody here, one of the main characters. He does show up
Mm-hmm.
in a decent amount of these too. Obviously, sometimes he's a good guy. Sometimes he's a person you want to punch his teeth in. Which, honestly, if you ask me, I could say that that's most of the appearances,
I
regardless of
was
your
gonna say,
opinion.
I feel like that line's kind of blurry, to be honest. Because even when he's meant to be someone we're supposed to like, it isn't always easy to like Jason Lee's characters in these movies. Which is nothing against Jason Lee.
No, no,
We
no.
like Jason Lee, and we absolutely love him in other things. But the characters that he's playing in some of these movies is like, this guy's a dick, and it's
Yeah.
hard to enjoy him.
Which is something I
Mm-hmm.
might save a little bit for later, but at least in the intro here, or at least the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
we also have Jeremy London who plays TS. So him and
Mm-hmm.
Jason Lee are kind of doing that like dual-headed main character kind of thing going on there, which we'll get into that.
Yep.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but they've got a couple of girlfriends where one is played
Mm-hmm.
like who is Claire Forlani, who's plays Brandy. Of course, she pairs up with TS. And then we've got Shannon Doherty, the late Shannon Doherty, rest in
Yes.
peace.
Mm-hmm.
She's the girlfriend here of Brody. And I've got to say, when it comes to like recognizable star power within the 90s, at least, we're kind of looking at trajectories here. A lot of
Yeah.
these actors are somewhat established.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, this isn't like a massive, production or anything.
No.
I even felt like back then I still knew who these people were.
Well, yeah. I mean, at this point, 95, Shannon Doherty, is Charmed going at this point in time. I think.
I think it had
Trying
to
to
have been
think.
soon.
Yeah, because this is Charmed is running around the same time as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I feel like Buffy had been going around, uh, maybe if not 95, a couple years afterwards into the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So I feel like, honestly cannot remember if Charmed came before or after Buffy premiered, but like this is Shannon Doherty's a rising star at this point in time.
Yeah.
Other people who have a little bit of up and coming is Joey Lauren Adams, who plays
Yes.
Gwen Turner in this, who is more popularly known for her role in Chasing Amy, which
Yes.
is also a part of the Askewniverse that comes later in this. Someone who you do get to see naked from the rear side in this, and would later become to known for his roles in both The Walking Dead and in the MCU. You do have Michael Rooker in this movie as well. But so yeah, if you're ever wondering what his ass looks like, you can watch Mallrats and you'll know exactly what it looked like when he was in his physical prime.
No,
I think, yeah.
he is still in his physical prime.
Which,
don't
don't
put that evil on Michael Rooker. He is still a good-looking man.
He's still a good-looking man, but like you're looking at like he's very well cut in this movie because again, you see him, like you see him naked from the waist up from both sides, and then just the ass,
dude. Joe,
on the backside.
as soon as we're like done with this and we put it out into the universe, I imagine that like Michael Rooker's like somehow hears about it and he's just like, put a bounty on his head, 40K.
Who says I'm not in my physical prime? You get in.
I'm Mary Poppins, y'all. Yeah. Yeah, he actually, I did not know him for a whole lot up until this point, outside of Cliffhanger. I mean, I had not really seen him in a whole lot. So I think I actually saw this. No, I saw Cliffhanger before this. And so I don't have a whole lot of, Rooker history behind me. But outside of him,
so even honestly, in the rewatch of this movie, I like oddly forgot that he was in here, and he doesn't have a small part in the movie. He has a pretty big role in this movie. He's definitely there, but I just completely forgot. Like, holy shit, yeah, that is Michael Rooker. He is in this movie. Speaking of someone doing his cameos well before he was known for his cameos, you do get Stan the Man Lee making an appearance here. And if you ever wondered what Stan looked like when he was younger, you have to go further back than 1995, I'm afraid, because he still looks like he did before he passed. He just had a beard. It is just crazy that he basically stayed frozen in time from the 1990s until he finally passed. He just went from a beard to a fine mustache.
I don't care what the photos say, Joe. He looked that way since birth. I don't care. There was just a Benjamin Button situation. He just never aged. It was just that he just
came out that way.
Yeah, born 70 years old, forever 70. But one last person who was Ethan Suplee, who's in this, who for a lot of people who saw Remember the Titans, they know him as the one of the biggest linemen possible in that film, and he's kind of gone through a transformation himself in recent memory. Got just in great shape, and but yeah, like he's also another string of people who continue to kind of get work in the Askewniverse. And so admittedly, Joe, there's a lot of decent like actors in this movie.
I was saying there's a ton of talent here.
Yeah, but there's some reasons why even well acted things can't succeed. And we'll get into a little bit of that. But as far as the movie goes, let's just break this down really quick. You've got two dudes who are on similar paths here where they both get ditched by their girlfriends. We won't go through all of the mechanics of it, but they both essentially have screwed up way too many times. Their girlfriends have had enough, and they kick them to the curb. And so they think of the one thing that they could possibly do to get over them both, which is let's go to the mall. Which I got to say, Joe, would not be my first choice, even in 1995.
We have to look at from the timepiece that it is. Is in the 90s, would you go to the mall to get over your ex? And the answer is still probably not, because I think when watching this movie, I think we kind of talked about how even in the 90s, mall culture was changing. It wasn't that they were emptying out. It wasn't that they were going broke. It was just they weren't the places where teenagers went to hang out anymore. They were basically at that point in time, in the point in time of this movie, it was a place where people went because they needed to shop, and that was kind of it. The idea of hanging out in the food court with your friends as something to do, or finding an arcade and hanging out there for hours on end, like those were just kind of the days of the past by the time this movie was already made. And that could have been one thing that kind of plagued the movie a little bit. But like you said, let's kind of get into more of what's going on in this movie. So we've established that we've got two guys who've just screwed up one too many times, and they go to the mall where they seem to have all of their friends. Their inner circle, if you have it, if you will, is hanging out in the mall at all times. This does include Jay and Silent Bob's character, Ethan Suplee's, and Joey Lauren Adams are all hanging out in the mall. And the whole movie is here. I think we should put outside of the first maybe 10 minutes where we established like the status quo is changing.
But there's a flea market in there. They kind of have that flea market,
which
you know.
They call the dirty mall.
Yeah.
So it's technically still in a mall.
So, Joe, if we're going to air grievances on this, what I will say is that this is where the movie does feel like it's a series of skits rather than natural progression in a movie. And I don't know if this is like a Kevin Smith starting to figure out writing a bit more or whatever it is. But to me, that was where like the early struggle really was with this. It's that you're not really getting pulled in by any individual story. Like like Ethan Suplee's character trying to see the boat in the 3D painting, which once again, the 3D artwork thing, like, yes, this movie has been dated.
When's the last time anyone saw a magic eye?
It has been a long ass time. And so like, I'm not going to try to beat up movies that obviously were made in the eras that they were created.
Yeah.
But when it comes to just what you're being introduced to, one of the things that really stands out that is really odd is a 15-year-old by the name of Trisha Jones, who the guys obviously both know. And she's literally sleeping with men who are 30 years old. And she's collecting all this data on them to write a book and all this stuff. And it's like, that's a crime, Joe. It
is a huge crime. And what's weird is they talk about, I think, how she already has like an HBO deal like set up based off of the book after it comes out. So what is odd? I mean, on top of the premise that she's 15 and doing this, what's odd is that apparently, I don't know if this is supposed to be commentary that people are so addicted to sex that they don't even care if it's legal or not, that it's willing to be picked up by like major networks at the time. So yeah, that is, I just, it's something in the film that I don't understand why it's there other than to, I guess, make something happen towards the end of the movie. Like that's its culminating thing. And if everything you needed, the character didn't have to be 15 to still have that point come across as us not liking a character in the movie is what it ultimately is what it's used for. But like to what you're saying over how this movie does kind of feel disjointed. And I will say that when I suggested to watch this movie, I remembered liking this movie. I enjoyed watching it with my brother when I was younger. And there's something about watching a movie that I shouldn't have been able to watch at that age with my brother that just was kind of like a fun bonding moment. And then there were, characters that have like this odd slacker yet intellectualness to them, in that you'll have like Brody's character has zero direction, has an incredible vocabulary.
What, you want to say something? Yeah, about a million things, but I can't express myself monosyllabically enough for you to understand them all.
Has a incredible understanding of how, oddly, how like somehow economics work to a point, has great comic book knowledge, is oddly connected to stories across the country about kids dying in escalators. It's this weird thing where he seems like he knows his shit, but still doesn't have his life together, doesn't seem to care. So I seem to like grasp on to individual parts and not see it from some of its whole, because as an adult watching it, this is where like the movie does feel disjointed. because you do have these two main characters who are on kind of, not even kind of, they're on they have the exact same problem as each other, as opposed to having similar problems that overlap and they would come together to solve. You have Jane, Silent Bob, who are in this movie, and while they are trying to help solve the main problem of, well, they're trying to, I guess, like solve the problem of getting one of these two back together with their girlfriends. It is in a really weird way of them trying to wreck a game show being filmed at the mall, and everything beyond their initial introduction is all slapstick. And I don't know, again, if that was Kevin Smith's idea over what he thought would be fun for the characters at the time. But that's basically what they are. And everything else just feels like it is things happening because they either need to happen or they just sort of happen. We have tension that happens between Brody's character and Ben Affleck's character, initially because they are just very idealistically different people. And then they just keep adding to Ben Affleck's character needing to be an asshole. So they just kind of make him more of an asshole as things go along. And specifically to Brody, as opposed to, like, you could just make him be an asshole to everybody. And we would get that we're not supposed to like the character. So, and then Ethan Suplee's character really doesn't do anything different other than he just really sucks at magic eyes through the whole movie. And that's just a recurring gag through the whole thing.
But I think this represents an era in maybe like maybe late teen, maybe even mid-teen cinema, where it's like you're making slackers kind of be your heroes. And to your point, Joe, how you've mentioned that you really liked it or remembered liking it when you were younger. It's like, yeah, I think we rooted for the slackers when we were maybe in school and we were like unsure of what it was we wanted to do in life. And now we're like looking back and going, did we really want to be the slacker? It's like, I don't think so.
No. And it's this kind of this thing. So for those of you who listen to the show and are not millennials or Gen X, something to try and help understand of what it was like to live in the 90s. If you were to compare, like, the 60s was this very experimental, open in everything, in every sense of the word, in every sense of society. And then it kind of was like the 70s was kind of like waking up from that trip, realizing that that's not how the world works. And there was kind of this rebelling of, like, this life that was promised from the 60s because it didn't come true. And then the 80s hit, and you get this massive boom in the economy and all of this, like, wonderful, like, what many people perceive to be a wonderful time. And to many, it kind of was. The 80s was the time, for lack of better terms, to be an American. Like, if you, from my understanding, like, if you were an American, you went overseas in the 80s, like, you were just kind of loved because of what American culture was bringing to the world. And then the 90s hit, and it's kind of like we woke up from, like, an incredible night out, and now we're kind of hungover and mad over our choices that we made. And the 90s is very much what the 70s was to the 60s, the 90s was to the 80s. And it's this idea that the establishment that the 80s promised and built wasn't quite there for everyone, and people are now lashing out against that because people were promised one thing and the finish line kind of kept moving back on them. And the 90s was the idea of us just kind of rebelling against that, and that even after college, some people decided to do nothing because it kind of felt like the world wasn't quite there for them. And I don't know if, like, the idea was to idolize the people who realized this, and Kevin Smith put that into his movie, of these people who also, very oddly, while realizing that the slacker mentality is the way to go because everything else is bullshit, seem to really love commercialism and commerce and being in the mall. So it's this weird juxtaposition of not liking the establishment, but really loving an establishment.
Well, it's anti-establishment that really represents almost all of Kevin Smith's, just film career and what he typically makes, is that you've always got these characters that are typically flawed in some way, but might be redeemable at certain points. And it is earlier in his career. So I'm not trying to bash him over the head with this, but his later writing would obviously become much better. And, Clerks 2 is a clear example of that, where it it kind of blends some pretty incredible comedy, very adult comedy, and then somehow manages to flip its head onto, okay, we've actually got some seriousness that blends in here. Little bit different with this movie. It doesn't really ever quite strike that, it never really quite gets there. So Joe, I think really what this ends up being is more of the fact that I think Kevin Smith had to level up a bit before he got to like a Clerks 2, right? Because obviously Clerks 2 came out quite a bit after, the first one. I think it was actually like 2006, maybe 2000.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So clearly he had improved his storytelling by that point in time, because as you kind of pointed out, Joe, I wouldn't say the comedy ever really reaches what he was able to do later within this movie. And to your point, Jay and Silent Bob, I feel like they represent anti-establishment, and that's what a lot of people kind of caught on to. But they don't really represent great cinema or even really great comedy in this film. Like it's like watching an old Looney Tunes cartoon.
Kind of, yeah. And I would say, again, like you said, like Kevin Smith really finds his groove by Clerks 2 in 2006. Between then and this movie, you get Dogma, which I remember like enjoying Dogma. I haven't watched it recently, so hopefully it's not the same rose-colored glasses effect I had quite with this movie. But even then, like I remember that was a definite build. Like we had a clear, like from the beginning, hey, these two angels are trying to wreck existence and they need to be stopped. And you kind of get this band of misfits along the way to try and stop them. And it has like this great build to it. You get Chris Rock pops in there. Alanis Morissette is in that movie. And then why am I forgetting? Oh my God, Alan Rickman, the late Alan Rickman is in that movie and does phenomenal. And that is one where you can really see if there is ever a clear transition point to beginning film creator to, hey, I think this guy's really onto something, and then, oh yeah, we've got something here. Dogma is definitely, hey, I think this guy's onto something, and Mallrats is a bit of that failure to launch, because like you said, it kind of does feel like a series of skits that have been put together to create a movie.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, once again, this is one thing I want to point out, is that I do think the actors did a great job with what they were tasked to do. I mean, I don't feel like their ability to deliver this was a problem at all. I actually, to the point of not liking Brody, I think I didn't like Brody as a character, for one, being older now, but two, because Jason Lee played him that well. He's kind of obtuse. He clearly just thinks that he represents this higher level of intelligence where it's like, no, you really don't. You got to learn yourself. And so I thought that the actors did a fine job with it, but honestly, most of the characters in this movie, I just didn't really find relatable otherwise, yeah.
I was gonna say, like to your point, either the characters aren't relatable, or they are some who just kind of obviously serve one purpose, and that's all they really do well. And even then, it's just weird that they're clearly there for a purpose, as opposed to feeling like a genuine character, right?
Yeah.
And even like Brody, like, I don't know, like, can you think of a movie where you start not liking the character, and it is very clear that like this character is not a good person, but by the end of the movie, you like the character?
No, I didn't like Brody from the get-go.
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. Yeah, that you don't like him at the start, and he doesn't change in the entire movie after going through everything he goes through, and even having this monumental moment with Stan Lee that happens in this movie that's supposed to act as like the message to wake the character up. He doesn't change.
Yeah.
Does he get what he wants in the end? Yes. Does he change? No.
It feels kind of Animal House in a sense, right? Like you don't really ever feel like your characters are on the right side of anything, and yet they still end up getting, they end up getting to eat their cake too at the end. And one of the things I've struggled with, I think, in the many years since this film's come out, is that I feel like TS is the better character, yet he is positioned as a main character, although he doesn't really ever feel that way. And Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say he's constantly overshadowed by Brody through the entire thing. And I don't know if that's just because Brody's character is just kind of naturally a louder character.
Yeah.
He just seems Jason Lee's character in this is just very boisterous and he shouts a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like TS, I think is the one that I think feels more like who you're supposed to relate to because he just kind of feels like that guy in every 90s movie or 80s movie or even early 2000s movie. He kind of seems like the staple of his decade, and yet
Yeah.
we don't see as much of him as we do Brody, as far as even as even like character development wise. Like you'd argue that really neither of them really grow because
No.
it's kind of like with Brody. You hate him in the beginning and you still kind of hate him in the end, even though he gets what he wants. And I was even trying to think of like a character again from another movie who you start out like you're not supposed to like them at the beginning of the movie, but they get growth and you like them in the end. I think of Real Steel with Hugh Jackman's character and how like you start the movie is like no this guy's he's a walking piece of shit, but by the end he's something like you enjoy him by the end of the movie, and that doesn't happen here with Brody. But with TS, it's kind of like he thinks he's right at the start of the movie, and by
Yeah.
the end of the movie, it just kind of turns out he was right. He just made one big, really dumb mistake, and by really dumb, it is also really big. But at the same time, he also doesn't grow, even though it's kind of implied that he's not supposed to, which is also very weird. Is that
Mm.
you kind of want your main characters to change through a movie, while they may have like a core set of values that remains the same. You do want to see them go through something that allows them to become a better
Yeah.
person or a changed person by the end, and that helps them get what they want, as opposed to they get what they want at the end of the movie because they're
Correct.
the main character.
It's there's no growth at all. It's literally just overcoming odds, and for pretty much happenstance or no reason at all.
Yeah.
And it is a little hard to get behind that, which is why, Joe, I want to ask this question: why is this movie a cult classic?
That that is something that I do struggle a little bit with because I don't know if it is because though for like those who may have grown up in a time period where they either did hang out in the mall a lot, which again wouldn't quite have been the crowd in this movie, but maybe those who wanted to be the kids hanging out in the mall when they were younger, and then when the 90s hit and they were no longer cool to hang out, they kind of oddly looked back at that's where they wanted to be, even though that's where they're not. Because it's just weird, right? Because it feels like a timepiece that is slightly out of time. Is like the mall is the cool place to hang out, even though by this time it's not the cool place to hang out. It's just where you go to go Christmas shopping for the most part.
It
Um,
it doesn't touch on any nostalgia that I have for the era, and I mean it might be accurate for like late '80s spilling into '90s,
mhm,
but I don't think it really makes sense for this era. But one thing that might change some opinions on that is that, like, if you're from Canada, for example, I know that Canada was a little bit different. It's a
mhm,
lot colder up there. Malls had served more of a function as opposed to,
yeah.
you know, you had to go there. So,
Mhm,
but Canada is not the selling point. That's not who they. This isn't pointed at Canadians.
mhm,
It's really just a weird premise for me, even given that time frame. And if you tried to update it, as we talked about before, Kevin Smith has tried to make another movie about this. Well, yeah, where would you set it nowadays if you tried to redo
mhm,
this? I mean, it, for me, if you can't advance the idea into a sequel, there's a reason for that. And we've seen a lot
mhm.
of bad sequels made, Joe.
Yeah.
I don't want to see a Mallrats 2.
It's one where it doesn't need to happen unless it is literally meant to be a short, like an internet short over people still hanging out in the mall and there being absolutely no one there. Like if it's self aware and making fun of itself, I think it would do great in that capacity. But other than that, I don't think it works. And even trying to think of like is this movie like a true timepiece and a staple of its time? They were very like there are a lot of '90s things in this movie there was a lot of like that the kind of the grunge and anti-establishment music that was used for the soundtrack. That like basically the style of the clothing is incredibly 90s. It is a Henley with another shirt underneath, rolled up to the sleeves, baggy pants, flannels wrapped around the waists, baggy t-shirts with like leather coats that are way too warm for the weather that they're currently in, but we wore them anyway because that was the 90s. That's 90s. But yeah, again, like it was a lot of 90s pieces in an oddly not 90s setting.
And not a cell phone in sight, people just enjoying the moment. And but Joe, speaking of being out of time, we are once again out of time. And honestly, there is one last thing I want to ask you though, before we go. Do we even like this movie?
I would say I still enjoy the movie. It's one of those things. I see its faults. I see that it's not perfect. I can see all the things wrong with the movie, but it's kind of like me if I had a really old dog that was pooping all over my house, but I absolutely loved that dog and the time we had when we were younger and he didn't poop all over my house. That's what I look back at as those times, and I'm going to look past the fact that he's pooping all over my house right now, Mark. What about you?
I personally treat it like the Ghostbusters 4-pack that came out that they included Answer the Call with, and I'm fine not answering that call. It's just not that movie that I want to reach for if I'm going to watch Kevin Smith movies. I would literally rather watch any other Kevin Smith movie. And he even once apologized for making this movie. So yeah, I can't. I mean, Joe, it literally feels like Ready Player One. You know, a creator who hates his own creation. I don't say he hates this, but for me, it's yeah.
So what you're saying is that if he was in a zombie apocalypse and he did his own makeup and was wandering around with zombies and he was accidentally shot in the chest because he's not a good practical joker, if he was asked if he had one regret, he'd be like, maybe Mallrats.
No. Yeah. Seriously. That's really at this point. It's not to quote the chef Ainsley Harriott. It's not my favorite, and but hey, with that, we do want to thank you for listening to the Digital Dissection Podcast. As always, we appreciate all the Dissection crew does for us week after week. Your support does go a long way, and if you like this episode, check us out on YouTube, where we make weekly videos about our favorite things.
We also love hearing from you, so feel free to message us over at digitaldissectionpodcast@gmail.com or in our communities across social media, where we love your ideas, suggestions, and, well, just about any other thing you've got for us, as long as it's tastefully done. So how about you drop that, and maybe your favorite place to eat in the food court. And until next time, keep on dissecting.